So, you want a lesson in terrible writing? Well, certain YouTubers might direct you to the first episode of She-Hulk for that. They might tell you it fails to properly set up its protagonist, that it's heavily reliant on low-hanging fruit and gender politics, but I'm here to tell you that there's a far better option for a lesson in terrible writing. And that's the Critical Drinker's She-Hulk video of the same name. This is an extremely poor critique of She-Hulk's premiere, so this video is all about how and why the Critical Drinker fails to make points. And I'll let you in on a little secret. This video wasn't supposed to exist. It started out as a segment in another video about the She-Hulk discourse I'm working on, but it kept ballooning, to the point where I thought it'd probably be better off as its own video, so I cut it out and got my good buddy TSD to join in for a little extra star power.
Hey, that's me, TSD.
Without further ado then, let's get into why this video is not great. So the basic thesis of the Drinker's video is that the scene is bad, because the rest of the episode didn't set it up properly. You know the scene, this one.
So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you. So all of this just feels like projecting.
And, like, off the bat, Drinker makes 2 points to detail this failure of setup. One, that
it doesn't actually show us any of the things she's complaining about.
Which...
Hey, we're just being friendly.
Yeah, where you going?
And two,
it fails to establish Jen as a sympathetic, likeable character that we care about.
And that second one's a weirdly subjective point to ground your argument in, especially coming like a minute after the guy admits he went into the show expecting trash.
Basically, I expected the show to be just another lazy Marvel TV product, with lame attempts at witty humour and an extra large helping of complaints about how generally awful and stupid men are. And well, that's exactly what we got.
Because after watching the premiere, I liked Jen. I cared about Jen, and I was sympathetic to her situation. And you're more than welcome to turn around and say, well, Pillar, Mr. of Garbage, that's just like your opinion, man. That's subjective, I don't feel the same. But that's the point, right? My liking of the way Jen's established, Drinker's disdain for it, these are both subjective. And he can support his view, point to this reason or that why he felt that way, but so can I, and I will in this video. So, I don't know, it just feels odd that the second main strand of his argument here is built on such shaky ground. Speaking of weak foundations though, the premise for this whole video, that this scene is bad and it reveals the flaws of the premiere, is founded kinda precariously on the assumption that this scene was supposed to be a big emotional payoff. Drinker's whole video after this point is exploring how the writers supposedly failed to accomplish this. But I don't think that's true. My take on this scene is precisely the opposite. If this story was a sloppy, straightforward hack job, then yes, you'd expect a big emotional payoff at this moment, as Jen seems to have not quite figured out the whole transforming back and forth thing, as her frustration grows at her whole new unrequested Hulk situation, and at Bruce for keeping her in Mexico, we might expect a breakthrough, a release, maybe as Jen comes to terms with her experiences and her anger. In broad strokes, that's kind of similar to how Bruce began to gain control over his Hulk in, say, the 2003 Ang Lee version, slowly, emotionally coming to terms with the links between his deep-rooted mental scars and his anger. Drinker's right, we don't get this, not really, but I think he's wrong in that this is the point. Jen isn't Bruce. Her experiences, her traumas, her condition, they're all different, and we, alongside Bruce, realize we shouldn't have assumed they weren't. That's classic She-Hulk. Jen in the comics always leaned on the fourth wall in a way most characters didn't, always played with the audience, always subverted their expectations. This reversal then is really as faithful a moment as we could have asked for. And moreover, it dovetails nicely with the feminist perspective. In our society, different genders experience shared phenomena in different ways. This is a point I'll be going into more detail on in my following video, but just as this scene throws into sharp relief the fundamental difference of Jen and Bruce's Hulk experience, so too does it make clear the difference in the ways men and women experience anger in the world, and maybe most important of all, the way that difference often goes unseen. And you can hear that point, or you can call it woke politicking, but at the very least, I think we should appreciate how this is a point that fits the scene, that works in tandem with the character stuff going on. Whatever it isn't shoehorned in. Admittedly, this is my interpretation of the scene. I can't say with any authority that it is the correct interpretation. if such a thing even exists, just like Drinky can't authoritatively state that his interpretation of the scene is correct. But at least I'm approaching this scene as it is, not as some failed reflection of a version of this episode which doesn't exist and never did. And if nothing else, the point here is that ambiguity, the fact that Drinker's based his scathing critique squarely upon a pretty uncharitable and narrow interpretation of a scene, seemingly without even realizing that this interpretation isn't some straightforward concrete truth. But even if you take TCD's premise as correct, which again I don't, he does a bad job defending it, straight up misrepresenting key areas.
But pay attention to this scene, 007, because this is the very first time we meet our protagonist. The problems begin in the very first scene, where Jen's rehearsing a speech that she's about to give in court, and her two co-workers are listening in. This is where the writers need to establish her as someone likeable, someone relatable, someone the audience can become invested in. But how to do this? They just have another character straight up tell us how amazing and smart and capable she is.
Drinker's just outright ignoring the opening speech itself. He talks later about what the rest of this scene reveals, or what he thinks it reveals about our protagonist, but he never seems to cotton on to the fact that what Jen says in her speech tells us about Jen. And it does. It tells us she's principled, she's capable but not overconfident, hence the practice run, and that she's a hard worker, willing to put the effort in to accomplish her goals. We can infer she's been at this for a while, grinding away, in a far less glamorous way than her cousin Bruce, to help the world, but that she's happy doing things this way. And here's the really funny part. Let's see the very beginning of that speech.
What is the responsibility of those with power? Do they merely have an obligation to refrain from the misuse of that power? Or do they have a duty to protect those without it?
As you may have noticed, it actually explicitly sets up one of Jen's major conflicts in this episode. The question of whether or not she can ethically return to her old job, her old life, after finding this new hulking power. This is hilarious to me, because this is like pretty much the exact thing the Drinker's saying this scene doesn't do, that it doesn't tell us about Jen's character, or build up to the struggles we see later, but it does. It opens with it. And I just know there's going to be some big brain critical Drinker viewers watching, poised to post a very intelligent comment saying something like, well, it sets it up, sure, but the episode doesn't resolve this, because Jen doesn't embrace her newfound power, she goes back to her old life. Let me just stop you right there. Two things. First, Jen makes that choice because she's aware that Hulk power isn't the only power, that her job holds power too, legal power, and that she still has a responsibility to help people with that power. And second, while scenes like this need to set up conflict in the episode, they also need to set up conflict for the season, and Jen's relationship with her Hulk power, and how far she can or should use that in addition to her legal power, is extremely clearly an ongoing tension throughout the show. This narrowness of interpretation, the way Drinker sees a scene doing one thing, and seizes upon that one thing and one thing alone as the sole purpose of the scene, is a running trend of the video. For instance, he's got a section complaining about the lazy writing visible when Marvel has characters talk about other characters. And I think TSD is going to touch on this later, so I'll be brief, but this is so reductive.
The script doesn't trust the audience to form their own opinions about this character, so it just straight up tells you what to think about her. This kind of thing is a hallmark of weak, insecure writers who don't have confidence in their own work, and it's happening more and more in Marvel projects these days. Loki telling his female counterpart how amazing she is, because otherwise we might not figure it out for ourselves.
You did it on your own. You had rings around them. You're amazing.
Drinker's saying Nikki's conversation with Jen in episode 1, and Loki's with Sylvie in Loki episode 4, this is Marvel not knowing how to naturally develop a protagonist, and instead having another character just, like, airdrop characterization into our brains. And I'm genuinely not sure how Drinker's missed this, but these moments aren't just about developing Jen or Sylvie. No, they're primarily developing the character of the person speaking. I mean, shit, Sylvie isn't even the protagonist in that example, Loki is. And the way he monologues about her tells us a bunch about where he's at in his journey. The fact that their initially antagonistic dynamic, still heavily present in the previous episode, is melting away into mutual admiration and warmer feelings, that Loki may not even be fully aware of the depth of them. The fact that this is likely because Loki sees himself in Sylvie, maybe even a better version of himself. The fact that even though Loki's this scheming trickster, this perennial liar, things do matter to him. His speech reveals these things to us. And with She-Hulk, this sets up Nikki's character perfectly. She's the yang to Jen's yin, the more positive, optimistic one. She cares about Jen, not merely in a professional sense. She's a hype man, or hype woman, I guess. And this is reasonably clear in the premiere alone, so long as you don't preemptively assume it's bad writing, but it's also made so very obvious in like every subsequent episode that this moment speaks to Nikki's character just as much as Jen's. And making this mistake, assuming otherwise in the way the Drinker does, is the perfect example of why coming down with an instant, scathing judgment of a show you've seen one episode of is ridiculous, premature, and poor critical practice. But yeah, narrowness of interpretation persists. Drinker goes on to moan about what Nikki's cheerleading and Jen's dismissal of that smug lawyer dude supposedly tell us about the character.
What it tells me is that Jen is already firmly in control of her life, her work environment, and the people around her. She easily deflects her male colleagues' doubts and sends him on his way without the least difficulty, and there's no indication that she's even particularly bothered by it. She's able to quickly and easily deal with objections, dissenting voices, and challenges to her authority. That's a good thing, right?
I don't want to spend too long on this because it's just the same pattern of the Drinker getting a fairly odd read on a scene and acting like it's the default concrete interpretation when it really isn't. Like, the guy says the scene shows us Jen's totally got a handle on her work situation, that she's easily able to effectively dismiss the lawyer dude, and that she's not at all bothered by it, case closed. But if that's the case, if what this scene tells us is that Jen's already beaten workplace misogyny at this point in her career, then why does it open with that male lawyer repeatedly interjecting when she's trying to practice her big finale?
Causing the deaths of innocent people.
Oh, that's so wordy.
They did this because they believed they would not be held accountable. Today, you, the jury, can prove that's not the case.
More smiles.
Show them that they will be held accountable.
You know what that tells me? That it doesn't matter how many times Jen rebuffs dudes like this, sticks to her guns, pushes them out of her office, her work is still habitually looked down upon by them. That she hasn't managed to actually secure their respect, and that fundamentally it doesn't matter how many times Jen does this.
Bye, Dennis.
You're gonna listen to a paralegal over another lawyer?
You didn't believe I was
Okay, this is unprofessional.
The comments, the interjections, the lack of respect, it all continues. And again, this is my interpretation. It isn't absolute, but again, neither is his. And hey, speaking of other people's interpretations, I've been talking long enough, so I'm gonna take a breather and let you all hear the TSD take.
Thanks, Pog. That introduction was so nice that it almost makes me forget that the abbreviation of your name reminds me of an outdated Twitch emote. But seriously, thank you for having me on, and let me just say, I do have some thoughts on our critical friend who drinks interpretation, shall we say, of the pilot episode of She-Hulk. So the interesting thing to me about the beginning of this video is that the critical drinker is very upfront about his expectations going into this show, which honestly makes analysis of his interpretation a lot easier. So point one to Team TCD for that. Right off the bat, he admits that he expects this show to be one that complains about men, and one that in his mind unfairly puts women on a pedestal while knocking men down a couple of pegs, so to speak. It's an offhanded comment, but if you take it into account, you realize that there's really nothing the show could have done to dissuade him from this position. Unless it took like a complete 180 from what it was and turned into a show about a male character like Bruce, which, you know, based on his later complaints, seems to be not too far off from what he wants, so. His opinion about the show is set in stone because any kind of female empowerment would feed directly into that narrative that he already has preconceived. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy and a no-win scenario for the show. With that in mind, it becomes his mission to prove that this preconceived notion of a badly written show that glorifies women is a reality, based off of the, at the time, only episode of She-Hulk, and he has to do quite a lot of complicated upper abdominal exercises to get to that point. You get it? Because you bend your back, that's bending your back, but bending over backwards. You get it. For starters, he absolutely butchers the context of the scene where Jen discusses having more control over her anger. I'm sure POG will touch on this in greater detail later, or maybe he already has. I'm writing this in like the weird wibbly wobbly timey-wimey space of September. But the angry alcoholic completely ridicules the statement, says it's based off of nothing, and then spends a good 5 minutes or so hammering home the idea that Jen isn't a likable or well-written protagonist. Which, first of all, as Pillar of Garbage noted before, likability is completely subjective. And second of all, Moist LaCroix here completely downplays what is actually well, competently written, with weird made-up scenarios and completely unfounded criticism. I have two main examples I want to touch on. His complete and utter misreading of the opening scene with Jen and her co-workers, and his weird criticism of the scene where Jen gets her powers. First off, the beginning of the episode.
Do they give her razor-sharp dialogue, a witty, fun, charming personality that you can't help but warm to, maybe work in a few little flaws, insecurities and shortcomings to make her more human and relatable? No, they just have another character straight up tell us how amazing and smart and capable she is. She's fierce, she's a girl boss, she's crushing it. The script doesn't trust the audience to form their own opinions about this character, so it just straight up tells you what to think about her.
Okay, so a lot to unpack here. So his whole problem with the scene is that he sees it as a missed opportunity for characterization. That what Nikki is saying about Jen is what you're supposed to take away from the scene as an audience member, and only that. But there's a lot more to read in this scene besides that. First off, we can see that Nikki is supportive of Jen, almost to a fault, and so that's character work being established for Nikki. And second of all, the fact that Jen needs this talk at all, combined with Tatiana Maslany's performance, shows us that Jen is nervous about performing well. But also seeing how she hypes up her own abilities in that same scene shows that she hides those insecurities under a layer of confidence. It's also worth noting that characterization doesn't just occur within the first 5 minutes of the show. Seeing how anxious Jen is to get back to her work and how she completely disregards a lot of Bruce's advice at first shows that she cares about her career, first of all, but also that she's clinging to any sense of normalcy she can find in a rapidly shifting situation. And that's just one example from this episode. And on the point that he goes on about how she's like silencing the voice of Gasp a man, when we're talking about the character that he's referring to, it's not like he was being helpful.
I feel like this is gonna land better coming from me. Look, we got plenty of time to switch things up and let me do the closing.
Dennis, you aren't.
And later on, we learn that he, emphasis on he and not men in general, because that's not what the show is saying, is a bit of a self-absorbed idiot. So it's not like Jen and Nikki were looking to him for amazing advice anyway. It's establishing key character traits for 3 main cast members in this show. And so really, it's a great opening scene if you look at it for what it is. Before we move on to the next weird point that he had, I wanted to take a little rest stop and talk about this one little bit where he talks about a bit from Captain Marvel, because apparently dude bro reviewers just can't let that movie go.
Like Maria in Captain Marvel, who feels the need to tell the audience that Carol Danvers is funny and crazy and kind, despite the movie showing us the exact opposite.
Now admittedly, Captain Marvel isn't like an amazing movie or anything, but this reading of the scene completely ignores the context that it's taking place within. Maria is describing to an amnesiac, Veers, the Carol that she knew because, after years of knowing nothing but Kree conditioning, Carol/Veers doesn't know who she is, and so she's actively seeking out information on that so she can kind of get more of a sense of her identity. The dissonance that he describes between some of the actions that Veers takes early on and the traits that are described here is intentional. It's not as wide of a gap as he's making it out to be, but the fact that there are differences between what she does and what Maria describes is the point. This has literally nothing to do with the rest of the video, but I just wanted to mention it.
I'm just gonna jump in here for a second too, because this point is whack. This moment, it's not for our benefit, it's for Carol's. We've seen her actions. We've already seen that somewhere within the conditioned Kree soldier, she is the things Maria is telling her. But as she's begun to remember more and more fragments of her previous existence, she's struggling to figure out what this all adds up to, who she is across both very different portions of her life. She's basically having an existential crisis until Maria brings together these key points of identity, making explicit to her long-lost friend that those moments where she hesitated or trusted or cracked wise or did anything else her Kree comrades would have disapproved of, those weren't aberrations, moments of weakness. They were her. It's about characterizing Carol, but also characterizing Maria as someone who's willing and able to make this powerful affirmation of identity for her friend, and about the ways friendship and connection can cut through crisis and trauma to ground someone. Maybe you don't like this beat personally, but it just isn't the one-dimensional squib of a scene that Drinker seems to think it is. Sorry for interrupting your point, TSD, but god, that bit sent me loco.
Yeah. Pillar of garbage, you should be sorry. Now, Captain Marvel tangent aside, back to She-Hulk. When the intolerable intoxicant talks about the scene where Jen gets her powers, he makes it a point to show that it's a scene that just could have been really good if they, I don't know, made it worse for Jen.
Now, imagine for a moment how much more impactful this scene might have been if Bruce had been the one to survive the crash and Jennifer had been badly injured instead. So bad, in fact, that conventional medical science could do nothing more for her. Faced with a difficult choice, Bruce reluctantly gives her a blood transfusion, saving her life at the cost of her humanity by turning her into a Hulk.
To give him credit, this imaginary scenario that he's describing could theoretically be a good dramatic scene. However, that's just it. It's way too dramatic for a show that intends to be a sitcom. That's just not the creative direction that those in charge of the show wanted to go. That's a bit of a theme with the inebriated interpreter's critiques and proposed solutions for this episode. A lot of the proposed changes would just make the show more dramatic. So maybe it's just that he doesn't like the sitcom angle, which, fair enough, I guess, sitcoms aren't for everyone. But it's not a problem with the show, and pretending like it is can lead to bizarre takeaways like this.
They couldn't have their creation lying helpless and injured on the ground. They were repulsed at the idea of a strong man pulling her from the wreckage and making important decisions about her future without her inputs. And so, just like the opening scene that could have been the setup for a satisfying emotional payoff later, they instead took the short-sighted option and went for a quick, easy and cheap win.
Okay, so this is really unfair once you realize what he's doing. You see, by describing a fake scenario where Bruce has a lot more agency and then immediately talking about how the man in the scene doesn't have any agency, he's making it an issue about gender when that's not really what the scene is about. The reason that Jen is conscious in this scene and Bruce isn't is because it's a pivotal scene in the show about She-Hulk, not the Hulk. Bruce is a side character and Jen is the main character. Plus, just because she has more agency in this scene than she does in the imagined scenario doesn't mean that she is like fully in control of the scene or anything. She still receives her powers completely against her will, and for a majority of the episode, she is trapped by those powers and the circumstances surrounding them. It's just a bizarre thing to get up in arms about. Anyway, that's just my take on those parts of the video in particular. There really is a lot to unpack in this video, so let's just keep on going. In fact, let's just see what he says next. Now, it's probably not that crazy, honestly.
Only for her to run into a group of evil men outside. I mean, I assume they're evil because that's clearly what the writer wants us to think. The problem is that they don't really do anything all that bad.
I don't even think I want to touch that. This, yeah, I think I'm gonna turn it back over to Pillar of Garbage now. I'll see you around.
That's a great place to throw it back to me, because those last points are wild, and I don't want to move on from them just yet. TSD's bang on about how Drinker's proposed alterations to this episode are kind of just pitching a heavier drama show rather than the sitcom She-Hulk is, and yeah, some of them might work for that, but that show doesn't exist. His imagined alternate episode 1 Gen might fit his imaginary show, but they don't fit the tone She-Hulk actually has, which makes it hilarious that he follows that section with this line.
The scene feels more like them projecting their own personal gripes, frustrations and hang-ups, followed by the fantasy resolution they wish they could have had themselves, rather than a logical component of a bigger narrative.
The problem with you is, you're completely delusional. I am? Sure.
Like, Jesus, I am Jack's complete lack of self-awareness, right? But some of these alterations wouldn't work, even in this fantasy She-Hulk drama series Drinker's cooked up in his imagination. Like the origin story he proposed. As TSD noted, this gives Bruce all the agency and the far richer internal conflict.
Faced with a difficult choice, Bruce reluctantly gives her a blood transfusion, saving her life at the cost of her humanity by turning her into a Hulk. You could have Bruce racked with guilt that he basically ruined her life, but also defiant because he ultimately took the difficult decision needed to keep her alive.
This is a great pitch for a hypothetical Hulk show, whose second season wanted to bring in She-Hulk as a supporting character. This'd be great for that. But this is Jen's show, and making this change, losing this agency, losing the weight of Jen's choice, that does not fit here. What's next?
Jen scaring the crap out of a bunch of dude bros who normally would have been scary and intimidating to.
Look, I'll be talking about that whole bar sequence a little more in my upcoming other She-Hulk video, but picking up where TSD understandably dipped, I will point out that the Drinker comes across as a Predator apologist, and not the fun kind, especially since he describes them as harassing drunken assholes when proposing moving this sequence around.
I mean, I assume they're evil because that's clearly what the writer wants us to think. The problem is that they don't really do anything all that bad, only to run into some drunken assholes who start harassing her.
So, like, which is it, bud? Are they harassing her, or didn't they do anything? Getting mixed signals here. But there's other issues with the Drinker's handling of this sequence. For one, he keeps assuming She-Hulk would have killed those guys, even though a major plot point is that She-Hulk isn't savage like Bruce's Hulk. That's a minor point, but it feels worth making. There is certainly a bigger issue, though. He thinks the episode needed to have shown us a pre-Hulk Jen getting harassed, and the toll this would have taken on her, because otherwise the big, solemn, emotional payoff he's invented doesn't hit as hard. But, like, the fact that this has happened to Jen before is fairly clear. The way she immediately recognizes what they're up to, defaults to a lie about her non-existent boyfriend being en route to pick her up because she knows there's a chance the idea of another man might get them to back off. The fact that this has happened before, and those times it didn't end with Jen hulking out, that is the obvious implication here. It isn't made explicit because it doesn't need to be explicit. Any reasonably intelligent adult viewer is aware that something like this will obviously have happened to Jen at some point previously, and can connect the dots this scene draws. If you need your Marvel show to tell you that this happens and how it would and does make women feel on the reg, then the problem might not be the show. And I guess, yeah, you could have done this sequence in the way Drinker describes. You could have made it explicit for all the sheltered men that, I don't know, have never talked to a woman about her life experiences. But that's also way darker and not exactly fitting for a sitcom. No, thinking about the conventions of the medium, there's a reason they left it as an implication. The Drinker also doesn't like the existing scene because it's power fantasy, I guess.
They wanted the female power fantasy of standing up to male bullies, of being the bigger, stronger one for a change, of putting men in their place.
And all I'll say here is, if you've got an issue with just the concept of power fantasy, you've got a fundamental issue with superhero media, and you probably aren't the right audience for it. Also, one last thing on this section.
Standing up to male bullies, of being the bigger, stronger one for a change, of putting men in their place.
It's not a fantasy about putting men in their place, it's about putting asshole men in their place. If you feel attacked by that, it isn't on the show because, believe it or not, there actually is a difference. The Drinker also has an issue with the Hulk training sequence because of course he does, although I'll give him this, he never actually calls Jen a Mary Sue, he just implies it, so point 2 to Team TCD for restraint. Maybe he realized that it isn't utterly inconceivable that Jen could have taken some yoga classes during the course of a life in LA. It is funny though that he makes the point about Jen beating Bruce at everything over footage of the exact opposite happening.
Jen is apparently better than Bruce in every way. She immediately excels in almost every activity, is Bruce's equal or even his better in every competitive event.
But no, that's different because she playfully mocks him. Toxic feminists be toxic, am I right, guys? Jesus fuck.
And on the one occasion where he demonstrates superior strength, she openly mocks him for being goaded into showing off. It's just that toxic male pride talking, I guess.
And that's the other funny part. The Drinker's complaints about the Mexico sequence frames Jen and Bruce's tension as this gender war, identity politics stuff. And sure, the episode is interested in the ways their genders and experiences play into their mindsets here, but I think he's really misreading moments like the above, because they're cousins. They love each other. Some of this is teasing, some is more serious, but at its worst, it's just a matter of misunderstandings and differing perspectives. It's a family argument, only with superpowers. It isn't as serious, as venomous, as toxic as his video kinda suggests. What we're left with, then, is an extremely narrow analysis of She-Hulk's first episode, built mainly upon uncharitable readings of key scenes, ones which don't seem aware of their own subjectivity, and ones transparently coloured by a series of openly admitted preconceptions formed well before the show's release. If that wasn't enough, it misrepresents scenes, omits important details, and seems oblivious to obvious implications. The Drinker's critique also seems devoted to holding the episode that actually exists up against an imagined alternative, an alternative which seemingly exists in a different genre, and surrenders the protagonist's agency and conflict to the episode's male guest star. This is not good analysis. This is not good writing. And it's bizarre how confidently clueless the drinker seems to be about all of this. He ends his video with a strange series of assumptions about the show's writers, with a segment ranting about how they were stroking their own egos instead of writing well. The irony being that with this segment, the drinker's doing precisely this.
It's all about the easy wins, the cheap dopamine hit, the constant search for validation and ego stroking. A chance for the writers to project all of their hang-ups and gripes and petty first world frustrations.
And there's any number of places I could take this video next. The really dumb way the guy came out with such a scathing piece after one episode, making points which turned out, surprise surprise, to not be borne out by subsequent installments, or the curious way the drinker orbits the alt-right pipeline, often echoing, in slightly more ambivalent terms, the same general narrative spread by the more outright bigots, benefiting from the same audiences while preserving a few shreds of plausible deniability by virtue of not actually saying the bad things, the dog whistles, only winking toward them. But to be honest, this video is already long enough, and I'm sure we'll get to those in the future. To conclude then, the She-Hulk writers probably aren't perfect at their jobs. There are genuine criticisms you could make, but from the looks of things, they're better at their jobs than you are, Will. Maybe try less critical drinking, more critical thinking, because in the end, what we're left with is a lesson in terrible writing. But it isn't a lesson in terrible TV writing, it's a lesson in terrible YouTube writing. If you want to help me get this seen by like even 1% of the millions who watched that video, don't forget to drop a like down below. Cheers for watching. Make sure you go check out TSD Talks, linked on screen now and down below, because there's some great content over there. I'm even in one of his videos talking about Disney's Star Wars. And as I said, I've got another wider video about the She-Hulk discourse coming out in like a week-ish. But I want to thank all my patrons on screen now, particularly Jonathan Francis Bond, Kevin Douglas, and Ian Fifield. See you later.